I have spent most of my life camping. Started when I was a kid, something my dad would take me out to do every summer. Back then, it was a fun thing, no real dangers, just the usual lessons about being careful, carrying a knife, and respecting the land. As I got older, I started going alone, enjoying the silence of the woods. The first time I ever felt real fear while camping was in 2015, somewhere deep in the Ozarks. I was 32 then, living in Arkansas, and had just gone through a rough patch in life. Work stress, relationship stress, everything was piling up. So I packed my gear, picked a random spot on the map, and drove out into the mountains to clear my head. I wanted isolation, real isolation, away from roads, trails, or campsites. Just me and the wild. I parked my truck on the side of an old dirt road that barely looked like it was used anymore. The trees were thick and there was no clear path, but I liked that. I grabbed my pack and rifle, locked up the truck, and started hiking in. The first few hours were peaceful. The further I went, the quieter it got. No hum of distant cars, no voices, just wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of animals. The terrain was rough, lots of thick underbrush and uneven ground, but I kept moving until I found a good clearing next to a slow-moving creek. It was the perfect spot. Flat ground, water nearby, and plenty of firewood. I set up camp, built a fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dipped, the temperature dropped, and I pulled my jacket tighter. Sitting by the fire, I finally felt that sense of peace I had been looking for. It was just me and the wild, no distractions. But as the night dragged on, that peace started to shift into something else. First, it was small things. The way the wind stopped completely, leaving the woods in an unnatural silence. The way the fire felt like it wasn't pushing back enough of the darkness. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar area. But then I started hearing things. Not normal forest noises, but something else. It started with the sound of twigs snapping. Not the random, scattered cracks from falling branches, but deliberate steps. Slow, heavy. It was coming from somewhere beyond my fire's light. I turned my head toward the sound, but there was nothing, just the black outline of trees. I grabbed my rifle and held it across my lap, telling myself it was probably a deer or a hog moving through the brush. Still, something about it didn't feel right. Animals are skittish. They don't move toward a fire like that. The sound stopped for a while, and I tried to shake the feeling off, but it didn't last. Later, as I lay in my tent, I heard it again. Closer, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Not fast, not darting like an animal, but slow, careful steps. Stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, staring up at the dark fabric of my tent, waiting for something to happen. But after a while, the noises faded, and I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a raccoon sniffing around, nothing more. By morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was up, the birds were chirping, and I almost laughed at myself for being so on edge the night before. I spent the day hiking, collecting firewood, and trying to enjoy the trip, but that feeling never fully left. As night came again, I built up the fire bigger this time. I didn't want as much darkness creeping in. The air was cold, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. I ate, sat by the fire for a while, then finally decided to call it a night. That's when I noticed it. My gear had been moved. Not much, but enough. My backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree, was now on its side. My mess kit had been pulled out, the metal utensils scattered on the ground. My rifle, which I had leaned against my tent, was now lying flat. Someone had been in my camp. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the rifle and slowly turned, scanning the trees. The fire cracked, but beyond that, the woods were still. Too still. Then a sound. Not from the trees, but from the other side of the creek. A splash. I turned toward the water, my eyes straining in the dim light. The creek wasn't deep, maybe up to my knees, but it was wide enough that I couldn't see the other bank clearly. Then another splash. Something or someone was crossing the water. I raised the rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. For the longest time, nothing moved. No more splashes, no more sounds. I stood there, waiting, the fire at my back. The hairs on my arms stood up. Then, just barely within the firelight, I saw it. A figure. Not an animal, not a shadow, an actual figure. Standing just beyond the creek, half hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of a person, tall, standing completely still. Watching. I didn't hesitate. I raised the rifle and fired a shot into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the trees. When the ringing in my ears faded, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The woods stayed quiet, too quiet. By morning, I packed up. I didn't waste time cooking, didn't take a last look around. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking back toward my truck. The whole way I felt watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I moved fast, not stopping, not resting, just pushing forward. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my pack into the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back at the trees one last time, and that's when I saw it again. A figure, standing at the tree line, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I just drove. I don't know who or what I saw out there. A drifter? A hunter? Someone living off the grid? I have no idea. But I've camped all my life, and I have never felt fear like that. I still camp, but never like that again. Never that deep, never that isolated. Somewhere in those woods, someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I never thought I'd find myself camping in a graveyard. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't some thrill-seeking stunt or a dare gone wrong. It was just bad luck. I was on a solo hiking trip, something I did every few months to clear my head. It was early autumn, and the air had that sharp edge to it, crisp and clean. I'd set out in the morning, following an old, barely maintained trail that cut through miles of dense woodland. The trees stretched high above, their branches intertwining like locked fingers, shutting out most of the daylight. I'd planned everything carefully, packed enough supplies, mapped out my route, and double-checked the weather forecast. But plans don't mean much when you get lost. Somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The trail markers disappeared, and soon I was wandering through an unmarked stretch of forest, the trees pressing in on all sides. My GPS had no signal. My map was useless. I walked for hours, hoping to find a road or at least another hiker, but I saw no one. Just the endless trees and the sound of my own footsteps crunching over dry leaves. Then, as the sky darkened and the first hints of dusk settled in, I saw it. Clearing, and in the middle of it, an old graveyard. The place looked forgotten. The iron gate was rusted and half broken, leaning at an angle as if it had been shoved aside by time. The headstones were cracked and covered in moss, some tilted, others completely fallen. A few stone crosses stood tall, their edges worn smooth by years of wind and rain. It didn't look like anyone had visited in decades. I had no choice but to stop. The sun was slipping fast, and I couldn't risk stumbling through the woods in the dark. I was exhausted, and setting up camp here, no matter how unsettling, was better than breaking an ankle in the middle of nowhere. I chose a flat patch of ground near the fence, careful not to pitch my tent too close to the graves. I wasn't superstitious, but sleeping on top of someone's final resting place just felt wrong. The air was colder here, heavier. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filled my lungs. As I set up my tent, I told myself there was nothing unusual about this place. It was just another patch of land, no different from any other clearing in the woods. Just stones and dirt, nothing more. But as the last light drained from the sky, that logic started to feel thinner. The silence was thick, too thick. The forest behind me, which had been alive with birds and rustling branches all day, had gone completely still. No wind, no chirping insects, just a heavy, waiting silence. I forced myself to ignore it. I unrolled my sleeping bag, turned on my lantern, and made a quick dinner. Dehydrated food never tasted good. But tonight, it was especially hard to choke down. My stomach was tight, like my body was bracing for something I couldn't see. I kept my lantern on longer than usual. The soft yellow light stretched out in a small circle around my tent, pushing back the darkness just enough. Beyond it, the graveyard melted into shadows, the headstones barely visible. I stared at them for a while, my eyes tracing the worn edges of names I couldn't read. Then I heard it, a sound, faint, almost too soft to notice. It came from somewhere in the graveyard, a rustling, a shift of movement on dry leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a fox, a raccoon, maybe a deer moving through the undergrowth. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The sound came again, closer, a slow, dragging noise, not the light step of an animal, something heavier. I turned off my lantern. The darkness swallowed everything. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, too loud. I sat frozen, my breath shallow, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, just as I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, a crunch, right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't blink. My body locked up, every muscle screaming to run, but I couldn't. The tent fabric was thin, too thin. Whatever was outside, if I made a noise, if I shifted even an inch, it would hear me. The air pressed down on me, thick and unmoving. Another sound, not footsteps, breathing, slow, deep, right outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whatever was out there. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing myself to stay still. My brain scrambled for logic, for an explanation that wasn't the thing my gut was screaming at me. Then the breathing stopped. Silence. Seconds crawled by. Then the zipper. A slow tug. Someone was trying to open my tent. I didn't think. I moved. I lunged for my pack, grabbed my hunting knife, and yanked the zipper from the inside before whoever was outside could open it. My breath came hard and fast. My fingers locked around the knife handle. Silence. I didn't know if they were still out there. I didn't want to know. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the tent wall, knife ready. At some point, exhaustion took over. My body couldn't handle the fear anymore. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because when I woke up, the sun was rising. My body ached. My head felt foggy, like I hadn't really slept. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the soft morning light filtering through the fabric of my tent. Then I remembered. I unzipped the tent slowly, my hands shaking. The graveyard looked the same as it had the night before. Empty, silent, nothing out of place, except for one thing: footprints. Deep, fresh footprints in the damp earth, leading from the trees, stopping right outside my tent, and nowhere else. Whoever had been out there never left. They just stood there, watching, waiting. I packed up my gear in minutes. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except getting out. I followed the clearest path I could find, walking fast, nearly running. I didn't stop. Hours later, I found a road, a car, a ride back to town. I never told anyone. I never went back, and I never camped alone again. I used to enjoy camping alone. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from everything, made me feel at ease. I worked in construction, and after weeks of long hours, there was nothing better than getting away for a few days. No ringing phones, no traffic, no deadlines. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. That changed one summer. I had a spot I always went to, deep in the national forest about 3 hours from my home. It wasn't an official campsite, no paved roads, no bathrooms, no fire pits. Just a clearing I found years ago, surrounded by thick trees and far from any trails. I never saw another person there. That was the whole point. I left early in the morning, packed light but brought the essentials. Tent, food, rifle. I had seen black bears out there before, and I didn't take chances. I also carried a pistol on my hip. Not for animals, just in case I ran into people. People were worse than any predator. The drive was peaceful. The roads turned from asphalt to gravel to dirt, then narrowed until they were barely wider than my truck. No tire tracks ahead of me, no signs of anyone around. I parked where I always did, off the road, hidden behind some brush. I hiked in a few miles, found my usual spot, and set up camp. The first day was uneventful. I fished a little, cooked over a small fire, and enjoyed the quiet. I always kept my rifle close, but I never needed it. I saw a few deer, some squirrels, the usual. As the sun set, I felt at ease. The air was cool, the fire crackled, and the stars came out one by one. It was in the middle of the night that things changed. I woke up suddenly, not to a noise. That was the problem, there was no noise. The woods were silent. No wind, no crickets, no owls. Just stillness. That wasn't right. Anyone who's spent time in the woods knows it's never completely quiet. I lay there, listening, staring at the ceiling of my tent. My rifle was next to me. I reached for it without thinking, gripping it tight. Then I heard it. A single footstep. Not an animal. It was heavy, deliberate, human. Came from the edge of the clearing, near the tree line. I stayed still, barely breathing. Another step. Closer. I'd been in the woods long enough to tell the difference between a deer stepping through brush and a person trying to move quietly. This was the second one. I shifted slowly, reaching for the zipper on my tent. I had no intention of calling out. If someone was out here, they had no good reason to be. And if they were trying to sneak up on me, they meant harm. I unzipped just enough to see outside. The fire had burned low, just embers glowing red. The trees were dark shadows against the night sky. First, I saw nothing. Then I saw movement. Something stood just inside the tree line. First, I thought it was a man, but something was off. It was too tall, too thin. Its arms hung low, longer than they should have been. It didn't move like a person, more like an animal. Slow, cautious. I tightened my grip on my rifle. It stepped forward, into the faint glow of the embers. It looked wrong. The skin was pale, almost gray. The shape of its body was human, but it wasn't. Its joints bent in ways they shouldn't. Its head tilted unnaturally, like it was listening. Then it spoke. My blood ran cold. It used my voice, not just similar. It was exact. The tone, the rhythm, like hearing a recording of myself. It repeated a single word. Hello. Then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Took another step. I raised my rifle. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I didn't fire. Something in the back of my mind screamed not to. Then it moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment it stood at the tree line. The next, it was just feet from my tent. I fired. The blast lit up the trees. The thing jerked, but it didn't fall. It made a sound, a horrible, twisting sound, like bones snapping. Then it turned and ran. Not like a man, not like an animal, something else. I heard it crashing through the woods, faster than any human could run. Then silence again. I didn't sleep. I sat there, rifle ready, listening. It didn't come back. To first light, I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just wanted out. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Tracks. They led from the trees to my tent. Long, deep impressions like a man walking barefoot. But the toes were wrong. Too long. Too many joints. I followed them with my eyes. They led back into the woods. Then they stopped. Not faded. Not covered. Just stopped. Like whatever made them had vanished. I didn't try to make sense of it. I just left. The drive home felt longer than before. I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see something behind me. When I got home, I locked every door, closed every curtain. For days, I jumped at every sound. I never went back to that spot. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that I was just tired, that I let my mind play tricks on me. But I know what I saw, and I know it saw me too. It was early autumn when I decided to go camping alone in the French countryside. I had been working long hours, stuck in an office, and needed a break from the city. I wanted solitude, fresh air, and the quiet of nature. I had done solo camping trips before, but this time I planned to go deeper into the wilderness, away from campsites and tourist trails. I chose a remote forest in eastern France, a place I had read about in a travel guide. It was known for its dense woods, rolling hills, and almost complete lack of human presence. That was exactly what I was looking for. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, enough food and water for 3 days, a knife, a flashlight, and my phone with an external battery. I drove out of the city in the morning, enjoying the changing landscape as buildings turned into open fields, then thick forests. The roads got narrower, winding through the trees, until I reached the small gravel path where I planned to park. I left my car hidden behind some bushes, grabbed my backpack, and started hiking deeper into the forest. It took me about 2 hours to find a good spot, a clearing surrounded by trees, far from any trails. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag inside, and gathered some firewood. By late afternoon, I had everything ready. I sat on a fallen log, drinking a bottle of water and listening to the sounds around me. The wind rustled the leaves, birds called to each other, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a stream. It was peaceful. As the sun started setting, I lit my small fire and cooked a simple meal: boiled rice with some canned meat. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth of the fire against the cool evening air. The forest had a different feeling at night. The sounds changed. The birds went quiet, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames, letting my mind relax. I wasn't thinking about work, about emails, about deadlines. I was just there in the moment. But then, as I looked into the darkness beyond the firelight, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A figure. First, I thought it was a tree, but then it moved. A person, standing just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. A woman. She was facing me, but I couldn't see her features clearly. She wasn't moving towards me, just standing there, watching. I felt my pulse quicken. Who was she? There were no houses nearby, no villages for miles. I had hiked deep into the forest. No one should be here. I stared at her, waiting for her to do something, say something, but she didn't. She just stood there, barely visible in the dim light. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe she was a hiker, lost and looking for help, but something felt off. Her posture, the way she just stood there. If she needed help, why wasn't she saying anything? I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. She didn't react. I reached for my flashlight, keeping my eyes on her. The moment I turned it on and aimed the beam at her, she moved. Not towards me, but away, stepping back into the trees. I barely got a glimpse of her face before she disappeared into the darkness. Pale skin, dark, unkempt hair. Her clothes looked old, tattered. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, my heart pounding. I listened for footsteps, for any sign that she was still nearby, but I heard nothing, just the wind through the trees. For a long time, I didn't move. Then, slowly, I reached for my knife and kept it close. I told myself that maybe she had been just as startled as I was. Maybe she had been camping nearby, had seen my fire, and was curious. But the way she had stood there, completely silent, unsettled me. Eventually, I forced myself to go inside my tent. I kept the knife next to me and left the flashlight on. I listened for any sounds outside, but the forest was silent. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me tense up. Several times, I thought I heard something moving outside, but when I held my breath and listened closely, there was nothing. Morning came slowly. The moment the sun was up, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. I walked around the clearing, looking for any sign that she had been there. Footprints, broken branches, anything. I found nothing. If she had been there, she had moved without disturbing the ground. That didn't make sense. The forest floor was covered in leaves, twigs. Even I had left footprints. I considered packing up and leaving, but I had come all this way for a break, and I didn't want to let one strange encounter ruin my trip. So I decided to stay, but I kept my knife on me at all times. The day passed without anything strange happening. I hiked a bit, gathered more firewood, cooked another meal. As the sun started setting, I felt that same unease creeping back in. The moment darkness fell, I kept my flashlight close, my knife in my hand. I didn't see her that night, but I felt like I was being watched. I kept turning my head, scanning the darkness, expecting to see her standing there again. At some point, exhaustion won. I went inside my tent, but I didn't sleep deeply. Every sound kept me on edge. The third night was worse. I had convinced myself that she was gone, that maybe I had imagined how strange she had been. But that night, I woke up to a sound right outside my tent. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. Not an animal. Not the wind. Someone was standing right outside. I gripped my knife, my body frozen. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then a sound, a slow, dragging movement, like something being pulled across the ground. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't unzip my tent. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things as quickly as possible. I stepped outside, my hands shaking. There were marks on the ground, long, dragged footprints leading away from my tent into the woods. I followed them for a few steps, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't wait to see if she would come back. I packed my tent, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and hiked back to my car without stopping. As I drove away from the forest, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the trees. I don't know who she was, why she was out there, or what she wanted. But I know one thing, I'll never go camping alone again. I had been hunting alone for years. It was something I enjoyed, being out in the wild with nothing but my rifle, my gear, and the silence of the woods. It wasn't about the kill for me. It was about the peace, the isolation, and the challenge. This time, I had picked a spot deep in the mountains of Montana, far from any roads or people. I had driven up as far as my truck would go, then hiked another 5 miles with my gear strapped to my back. The plan was simple: set up camp near a river, track deer or elk for a few days, and then head home. I had done this dozens of times before, but this time felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the weather. The sky had been gray the entire drive up, thick with low clouds that never quite broke into rain but kept the forest dark even in the middle of the day. The air had a damp, heavy feel to it, and the wind barely moved through the trees. I found a decent clearing to set up camp, about 20 yards from the river. It wasn't a perfect spot, but it would do. The trees were thick around me, providing some cover, but not so dense that I couldn't see if something or someone was approaching. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As I ate, I listened to the sounds of the forest. Something was off. Normally, even at dusk, you could hear the usual forest sounds: birds, rustling leaves, the occasional crack of a branch as an animal moved through the brush. But tonight, it was almost dead silent. The only sound was the water moving through the river, steady and constant. I told myself I was overthinking things. Sometimes the woods just got quiet. Maybe a predator was nearby, a mountain lion maybe. That would explain the silence. I'd seen them before on hunts, but they usually avoided people. I finished eating, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. I always kept my rifle close when I was out alone, so I laid it beside me as I settled in for the night. The first few hours were uneventful. I dozed in and out of sleep, waking up occasionally at the slightest sound outside. It was just the wind, I told myself, just the trees shifting. But then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something. A single, sharp snap of a twig. My eyes opened instantly. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I sat up slowly, reaching for my rifle, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any more movement. The silence had returned. The kind of silence that wasn't natural. The kind that meant something was nearby, waiting. I waited for what felt like forever, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had just been a small animal, a raccoon, maybe. I laid back down, still gripping my rifle. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The forest had its sounds back, birds chirping, the wind moving through the trees. I shook off the uneasy feeling from the night before, packed my gear, and headed out to track some deer. I moved slowly through the woods, scanning for tracks, broken branches, anything that might give away an animal's movement. After about an hour, I found fresh tracks leading uphill. I followed them, keeping quiet, stepping carefully over leaves and twigs. Then I saw it. Not a deer, not an elk. A footprint. It was human, barefoot. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it. It wasn't old. The edges were still sharp in the dirt, meaning whoever had made it had been here recently. 100 thoughts ran through my head. Who the hell would be out here walking around barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I was miles from any roads, and I hadn't seen a single sign of another camper or hunter. I crouched down, studying it. The size was strange, long, narrow. The toes were splayed out like whoever had made it had been gripping the ground with their feet. It wasn't normal. I stood up and looked around, scanning the trees, the rocks, the brush. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept moving, rifle in hand, more alert now. My hunt was over. I didn't care about tracking deer anymore. I just wanted to figure out what the hell was going on. As I made my way back toward camp, I found more footprints. They were leading toward my campsite. I picked up my pace, my heart thudding in my chest. I moved as quickly as I could without making too much noise, every instinct in me screaming that something was wrong. When I got back to my camp, my stomach dropped. My gear was still there, but something was off. My tent flap was open. I had zipped it closed before I left. I stepped forward cautiously, rifle raised. I pushed the tent flap aside and looked inside. Nothing, but my sleeping bag had been moved. Not thrown or dragged, just shifted, like someone had been inside and had sat there for a while. I backed out of the tent, scanning the trees. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I needed to leave. Now, I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my bag. I didn't bother rolling up my tent properly. I just shoved it in and slung my pack over my shoulders. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. A twig snapping. This time it was close. Too close. I spun around, rifle raised, scanning the trees. Nothing. I started moving fast. I didn't run, but I walked as quickly as I could without making too much noise. My truck was 5 miles away. I needed to get there. I kept my rifle ready, my eyes darting from tree to tree. Every few minutes, I heard something behind me. A rustle, a footstep, a breath. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The feeling of being watched never left me. The entire hike back, I felt it, like something was just beyond my sight, waiting. When I finally saw my truck, I nearly collapsed from relief. I practically ran the last stretch, yanked open the door, and threw my gear inside. I didn't take my time getting out of there. I fired up the engine, slammed it into gear, and tore down the dirt road faster than I ever had before. As I drove, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something step out of the trees. Tall, thin, watching. But by the time I blinked, it was gone. I never went back to that spot again. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the wilderness. Not in a survivalist way, but in a way where I could just be away from everything. No noise, no people, no stress. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, the crunch of dirt under my boots, the steady crackling of a fire as I sat back and let my mind go blank. That's why I started taking solo camping trips a few times a year. I'd pick a place deep in the woods, somewhere away from trails and crowds, and I'd spend a few days just existing out there. I wasn't reckless about it. I always packed enough supplies, carried a satellite phone in case of emergencies, and told someone where I'd be. I had done this for years without a problem. But last year, something changed. I had planned a week-long camping trip in a remote part of the Pacific Northwest, somewhere far enough from people that I wouldn't hear another human voice the entire time I was there. I had scouted the area months before and picked a spot near a small lake, surrounded by thick forest. There was no road leading to it, no cabins nearby, nothing but miles and miles of wilderness in every direction. It was perfect. I drove as far as the old logging roads would take me, then hiked the rest of the way in with my gear. It took me most of the day to reach my campsite, and by the time I got there, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked myself a quick meal. Everything felt right. The first night was uneventful. I listened to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day, I explored the area, made sure I was familiar with the land, and checked for any signs of large predators. The last thing I wanted was to stumble across a bear's territory without knowing it. But I found nothing out of the ordinary. No tracks, no scat, no claw marks on trees. Just untouched wilderness. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel something strange. Not fear exactly, but an odd kind of unease. Like I was being watched. It made no sense. There was no one out here. I hadn't seen a single person since I left my truck. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I shook it off, crawled into my tent, and forced myself to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A light, shuffling noise just outside my tent. Not an animal, not a person walking normally, more like something moving low to the ground, dragging itself over the dirt and leaves. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I lay there, waiting, my heart pounding in my ears, but I heard nothing else. After a long time, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it had just been the wind. Maybe a branch had fallen. I didn't know. The next morning, I checked around my tent but saw nothing strange. No footprints, no disturbed earth. Just normal forest floor. I told myself I was being paranoid. But that night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. I had just gotten into my sleeping bag when I heard it. The same shuffling sound, slow and deliberate, moving around the tent. Closer this time. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves, the slight scratch of something against the nylon of my tent. I stayed completely still. Then something pressed against the fabric. Not hard, not aggressive, just a slow, deliberate pressure, right near my head. I nearly stopped breathing. I stayed that way for what felt like an eternity, my body frozen, my mind racing. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the pressure disappeared. The sound moved away, and then it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I got up and checked the area again. Still nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I was just spooking myself out, that it was all in my head. I had spent years camping alone. I had never had a problem before. Why would this time be any different? So I stayed. That was a mistake. The fourth night was when I finally understood that I needed to leave. I had built my fire higher than usual, trying to push back the darkness. The unease had been growing all day, like an itch in the back of my mind. The forest felt different, quieter. The usual night sounds were gone. No insects, no rustling in the bushes, no distant owl calls, just silence. Then, as I sat there, I saw something. Not clearly, just movement deep in the trees. A shifting of shadows, a brief break in the darkness. Something was out there, watching me. I forced myself to stay calm. If it was an animal, I didn't want to startle it. If it was a person, well, I didn't know what they wanted, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. I kept my knife close, my headlamp ready. Hours passed. Then, just as I started to think maybe it was all in my head, I heard it again, the shuffling. But this time, it wasn't near my tent. It was near the fire. I didn't move. Slowly, I reached for my light and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. And for just a second, less than a second, I saw something. A shape, low to the ground, just beyond the firelight. Then it was gone. That was enough for me. I didn't wait until morning. I packed my gear as fast as I could, doused the fire, and started hiking out. I had a GPS, I knew the way back, and I wasn't going to spend another minute in that place. The whole way I felt it. The watching, the quiet, the sense that something was just behind me, just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove until I hit pavement. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back since, and I never will. The last time I saw my brother was in the fall of 2013. It was during a routine army training exercise in the remote forests of Montana. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, and I had no idea he would be anywhere near where we were. Seeing him out there, in the middle of nowhere, wasn't just unexpected, it was disturbing. I remember the cold, the kind that crawled under your clothes, even with the thickest layers. The trees stretched for miles, dark and unyielding. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind through the branches and the crunch of damp leaves under our boots. I was part of a small unit sent out for a long-range recon drill. Just 6 of us, all carrying heavy rucksacks, rifles, and enough gear to last 3 days. We were meant to move deep into the woods, set up an observation post, and report back. Simple on paper, but nothing ever stays simple. The first day went as planned. We hiked over 10 miles through rugged terrain, moving in a staggered formation. The forest was thick, but we followed an old hunting trail, using GPS coordinates to check our position. By late afternoon, we reached our designated area, a clearing near a small, slow-moving river. We spread out, set up our camouflaged observation post, and took turns on watch. The night was uneventful, though the distant howls of coyotes kept us alert. On the second day, things changed. It started with footprints. One of the guys, Carter, spotted them first. Deep impressions in the damp earth, slightly smudged from the wind. They weren't from any of us. The spacing was wrong, and they were fresh. Someone had been moving through the woods near our position, sometime during the night. We didn't panic. It was hunting season, and civilians sometimes wandered too far off trail. Still, we had orders. If we saw anyone, we were to observe from a distance and avoid contact. We decided to reposition slightly, moving deeper into the treeline for better cover. By evening, the forest felt different. The air had a weight to it, thick and pressing. Every small sound seemed louder. A snapping twig made us all freeze. We weren't alone. That night, I took the second watch. The cold had deepened, and mist clung to the ground like low-lying smoke. The trees were tall and shadowy, barely swaying in the wind. I kept my rifle close, scanning the darkness. Then I saw him. At first, I thought it was one of our guys checking the perimeter. A tall figure stood just beyond the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the branches. My heart pounded. I gripped my rifle, peering closer. Then he stepped forward. Even in the dim light, I recognized him. The build, the way he carried himself. It was my brother. I blinked hard, my mind racing. He wasn't supposed to be here. Last I heard, he had left the army. He had vanished from my life, cutting contact with me and the rest of our family. But now, here he was, standing in the middle of the forest, watching me. I wanted to call out, but something in me hesitated. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. He didn't move like I remembered. His stance was off, rigid, unnatural. And he wasn't dressed like a soldier. No gear, no pack, just dark clothing that blended too well with the night. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I stayed frozen for a long time, gripping my rifle until my hands ached. When my shift ended, I didn't say anything to the others. I barely slept. The next day, I checked the area where I had seen him. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. Then Carter saw him too. It was mid-afternoon when he whispered to me, his face pale. "There's someone watching us," he said, barely moving his lips. I followed his gaze. There, deeper in the trees, stood my brother. The same position as last night. Same posture. Same silent stare. Then he was gone. Carter looked at me, his expression tight with unease. Who the hell was that? I didn't answer. That evening, we decided to pack up and move. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, and the others were getting nervous. We broke down our camp, moving under the cover of dusk. Then we found the cabin. It wasn't on our map. A small, run-down structure half hidden by dense undergrowth. It looked abandoned. Weathered wood, a sagging roof, a rusted metal door barely hanging on its hinges. No windows. No signs of recent activity. But the door was open. We hesitated. We should have left it alone. But curiosity got the better of us. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The walls were covered in old newspaper clippings, all yellowed with age. The floor was bare except for a single, rotting mattress in the corner. But what made my stomach tighten was what was on the walls. Pictures, dozens of them, of me, of my family, of my brother. Some were old photos I remembered from childhood. Others were more recent. Some I didn't even know had been taken. And then there were the notes, scratched into the wood, barely legible. My name, my brother's name, repeated over and over again. The others saw it too. No one spoke. No one needed to. Then we heard footsteps outside. Heavy, slow. We killed the lights, pressing ourselves against the walls. The footsteps circled the cabin, deliberate, measured. Then they stopped. For the longest time, we waited, listening to the silence. Then a soft scratching sound started at the door. A slow, deliberate scraping like nails dragging over the metal. We didn't move. Minutes passed, then hours. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the walls, we finally dared to move. When we stepped outside, the forest was empty. The footprints in the dirt were deep, circling the cabin again and again. But they weren't human. The spacing was wrong. The depth was uneven, like someone or something had been crawling. We didn't stay. We hiked back, moving fast, barely speaking. When we finally reached the main camp, I went straight to the CO. I told him everything. He listened. Then he looked at me, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing out there," he said. "That cabin burned down years ago." I didn't argue. I just nodded and left. I never saw my brother again. To this day, I don't know if he was really there or if something else was wearing his face. But I never went back into those woods. And I never will.